For joining us tonight. It's nice to see everyone here. We're really excited tonight. We have a couple special guests with us from Oahu. We have Dr. Ashley Lukens, who is from the Center for Food Safety. We also have a couple of esteemed guests in our audience. I won't point them out so that they can relax and enjoy tonight's session. And we have two people who have traveled all the way from the Philippines to be with us tonight. We have, I'm going to read their bios for you, but we have Dr. Romeo, how do you say his last name? Quijano. Dr. Romeo Quijano. He is a medical doctor and a professor of pharmacology and toxicology at the University of the Philippines in Manila. He's also the president of the Pesticide Action Network in the Philippines and the former co-chairman, of the International POP's, is this the Elimination Network, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And Dr. Quijano has traveled around Asia and the Pacific, working with communities to document and treat chemical exposure to organizations and advocates for change. Organize and advocate for change. Excuse me for fumbling that up so badly. Sorry, Doctor. Traveling with him this evening is also Gilbert Sape, and Gilbert is an organizer and international campaigner. He's formerly coordinator of the Food Sovereignty and Ecological Agricultural Programs at the Pesticide Action Network, Asia and Pacific. Most recently, he has been involved in building capacity of communities in Asia, in resisting land grabbing and doing policy advocacy at the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. He is currently involved in negotiations on the new Food and Agriculture Organization Principles and Responsible Agriculture Investment. And that is a mouthful, I know. But they're going to come up and they're going to tell you a little bit more about that, so you'll get to know what all that means and what these organizations are and just how they're working to make change in our community. Before I say goodnight, I'm just going to say my name is Chandel. I am a local resident here in Hilo. I work with GMO-free Hawaii Island. And we are a grassroots organization right here in our community that's working together to really do what we can to bring about awareness about pesticides and GMOs and to protect our island and our farming industry. So thank you very much again for being with us tonight. I'm going to pass the mic over to Ashley so she can say a few words before we begin.
I have a pretty loud voice. Can everybody hear me?
Please use the mic.
Is that?
Yeah, it should have been on. You see the green light?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that better?
Better,
Okay, great. So we just wanted to say, first of all, mahalo nui for being here tonight. We really appreciate sort of everybody's continued attention and concerns around issues of genetic engineering and pesticides in Hawaii. And every time that we go around the state for a tour like this, and we were recently on a tour with Dr. Tyrone Hayes, I'm just amazed that folks are turning out time and time again, that the audience is growing, that the conversation is shifting and evolving and changing, and we are all, I think, as volunteers, really committed to starting not only to address the issues that are happening here in Hawaii, but frame and start enacting solutions. So thank you. And extra special thanks to Chandel and Blake. They are our feet on the ground here on Hawaii Island, and it is wonderful to work with organizations. Similarly, I'd like to thank Megan. I don't know if Megan is outside. Okay. Megan has been working as a coordinator for Center for Food Safety on Hawaii Island, just sort of on a part-time basis, and it's been really nice to have you here passing out flyers and helping us. And then also, thank you to Chair Silverstein from Sweet Cane Cafe. She brought the food. A lot of it's local. They're really intentional about their sourcing, and it's amazing to have really weird concoctions that she gets from her experiments in gleaning and taking the extras from farmers. Last night we had was it jackfruit hummus? Jackfruit seed hummus. And she was thinking, we just want to continue minimizing the waste at the restaurant. So we're learning how to use all sorts of ingredients and craft them into really delicious things. And if I've learned anything in being a professor of food politics for the past 8 years, it's that sometimes our mouths can teach us what our minds cannot. And to taste the sort of wonderful abundance of Hawaii Island is a reminder that we can have a better food system here in Hawaii. So thank you to Chair Ev and to all the farmers that helped source the ingredients for tonight's food. We're really honored to have both Gilbert and Romy here visiting us from the Philippines. Gilbert's actually here from Thailand, so very long distances traveled. And the purpose of this tour is to sort of help us as a community begin to really consciously grapple with the question of how we can frame an issue that has largely been discussed in terms of health and environment, as one in terms of worker safety and food justice. So often when we talk about issues of genetic engineering or issues of pesticides, we render silent those lives that are working most intimately with those chemicals, and those are the farm workers. We were just on Kauai, where I think the question of worker safety is most to the forefront in that community. When they passed Bill 2491, they decided to frame their legislative initiative in terms of pesticides. And it really brought forward the question of what is the relationship between genetic engineering and pesticides. And for those of us that live on the other islands, not in Hawaii Island, we know that most of the genetic engineering that's happening on our islands are happening to crops that have been designed to promote the use of pesticides. So for us, the issue of pesticides and genetic engineering are inextricably tied. And in that way, when we seek to regulate genetic engineering or pesticide use, it's oftentimes seen as something that's anti-worker, right? Something that goes against the economy in Hawaii. And we really need to change that conversation, because the fight to regulate GMOs is also a fight for a safer workplace. It's a workplace where folks can go and grow agricultural commodities and not fear for their own health and well-being. And nobody has been a stronger advocate for raising awareness about the health impacts of pesticide exposure than Dr. Quijano. One of the things he said last night that really struck me is he said, so often when we talk about the risks that workers take when they choose to work with restricted use pesticides, so often we ask farmers, is this safe? Okay? But perhaps that's not the proper area of expertise. Who we really need to be asking are doctors, our medical professionals who can help us understand the health impacts of exposures to chemicals and toxins. And that is really Dr. Quijano's area of expertise. What Dr. Quijano has done with that expertise, though, is not sort of serve as a siloed expert, writing articles from the ivory tower. He's really sought to embed that knowledge in communities, so that communities can begin to take control over their own health and create pesticide monitoring programs that really empower them to document the health impacts of pesticide exposure, and then use that documentation to lobby for and demand better regulations and safer workplaces. And I really think that that's the attitude that we need to take here in Hawaii, is that our movement is one that seeks to empower communities, communities that include agricultural workers, that have a long history of resistance and empowerment here in Hawaii, to demand a safer workplace for them and their families and all of us who are possibly exposed to agricultural chemicals in our everyday lives. So without hesitation, I would like to just ask you to join me in a warm round of applause for Dr. Quijano.
Thank you, Ashley. Good afternoon to everybody. Mahalo. It's with great pleasure to be with you tonight. I mean, really. I'm under a lot of pressure, I guess. not used to this kind of thing. You forgive me if I fumble once in a while. I've been given the task, which is not really very easy because they asked me to compress what I do usually in 2 hours, but I'll try to do justice to the expectations. But after what Ashley said, I feel like I may not be able to be up to par. But anyway, I'll try my best. And I was asked also to clarify my international work for the purpose of documentation, I guess. I was also working as a representative of the international NGOs at the Intergovernmental Forum on Chemical Safety since 1996, I think, up to 2006. I had a chance to really be participating in a lot of serious discussions at the United Nations level with high-level delegations of governments. And I had a lot of learning there. And it amazed me how governments really can control the lives of the people, and therefore people tend to be left out of the decisions. Sometimes governments decide just because of one meeting with another person without really the participation of the people who would eventually suffer because of those decisions. So I thought working with the international community is not my line of work, so after 2006 I decided to go back, spend more time with the communities, and I thought the communities are more important, is a more important arena needing my expertise. So I'm a medical toxicologist, so I thought that I needed to share more the information that's with me and explain it in a way that people will understand. So we developed community-based learning programs, including manuals and everything. So we've been going around. So that has been part of our international work. Sorry for that long introduction. Can I proceed now? And I always start my discussions by looking at the problem in a more holistic way. And I often ask participants in the audience how they would define good health. But since I don't have time to do that, I'll just go through these general assumptions that I thought important in the understanding of health and its relation to pesticides and other poisons in the environment, and how the environment is actually involved in this picture. So I hope you agree with me in saying that the human being is an integral part of the living earth, which is a living environment. If you don't agree with me, it's okay. But please keep quiet for a moment until I finish. And then the environment is affected by economic, political, and cultural factors. The integrity of the human being is largely determined by the integrity of the environment. Unfortunately, a lot of my colleagues in the health profession do not believe in this statement. I've had some discussions with them because of this before, but it's okay. It can be a source of good discussion anyway. And that good health is the state of harmony between the individual and the environment. You can also say community and the environment. And that illness is the result of the disruption of this harmony between the individual and the environment. Can you notice the difference in the usual definition of illness? Because we were taught when we were medical students, when you get tuberculosis, the culprit is the TB bacillus, right? And that's it. They're giving you antibiotics to kill that virus, that bacterium. They never talk about your poor housing condition. They never talk about the poverty in the family. They never talk about the poor environment where these people live. It's just the bacterium. That's it, finished. So that's a very reductionist type of understanding. And even from the very beginning, I had some doubts, but only after I finished my medical school when I really believed that was wrong. Come to think of it, they were teaching us a lot of wrong things, and yet we believe them. And that's often the case in the mainstream educational system. And therefore, we need to reframe the questions about health. And I came up with some kind of formulation, somehow to try to simplify, but it's really difficult to simplify. But just to illustrate the important relationships between different factors that might affect health and the relationship with the environment. So I came up with different elements that would be important in the relationship between health and environment. And illness will be the result of a disruption of any of these factors, or one or more of these factors that would affect the other factors. So one is not independent of another. That's why they have these connecting lines. I don't have time again to elaborate, but just to introduce to you the idea of this general concept. We have the physical, biological, chemical, spiritual, and social factors. Most of my colleagues would agree with the 4 factors, but not with the spiritual factors. So again, that's a big area of discussion, but just to illustrate the fact that, for example, when your when your house is demolished by a bulldozer, which happens a lot of times in countries like the Philippines, then that physical phenomenon will affect your biological status. Blood pressure will go high, things like that, and chemical also, because a lot of the chemical things in the environment will probably be polluting your water, and spiritual, of course, especially for the indigenous people. That is a sacred place that would alter their spiritual status and destroy that kind of spiritual harmony with nature. And of course, the social factor. You destroy the livelihood of the people, they have nothing to it. Of course, you'll get sick. So all this kind of relationships. Also, the same is true if you go to the other factors there, but I'll probably be focusing my attention more on the social factors because that is encompassing of many other factors. And therefore, when we talk about pesticide poisoning, it's really very difficult to determine the relationship, a direct relationship between the specific pesticide and the illness because of all these other factors that are confounding the entire situation, including spiritual factor. And when I say spiritual, I don't mean just about religion. Everybody has a spirit, I guess, even people who don't believe in God. And I think the indigenous people will understand this better. And this will include, of course, aspects of your faith, your belief systems, your emotion, even your psychological status perhaps, the other things that we consider paranormal or things like that. And we know, of course, we're familiar that there's such a thing as a spiritual healing. Unfortunately, again, most of my colleagues in the medical profession, if you talk about this, they say you are a quack doctor or something, but I don't mind them calling me a quack doctor, as long as I do some good service to my patients. In fact, I tried this spiritual thing in some of my patients, and I find it very useful. For example, when a patient comes in with hypertension, high blood pressure, usually mainstream physician in the clinic, especially with a lot of patients, immediately will prescribe an antihypertensive medicine to lower the blood pressure. They no longer bother to ask whether there's conflict in the family or about certain problems, or perhaps if he's a spiritual kind of person, whether there's something, some doubts in his faith or something like that. To me, these are all related. It could be a biggest factor that's causing the hypertension. And so I usually refuse to give immediately a prescription of medicines, but try to be conservative about it. And I think most of the time, patients respond. That shows that the spiritual factor still is a very strong factor. And I have a good friend, and one of them is a priest, who actually do spiritual healing. And not only the priest, but some other people who do spiritual healing. And they've had a lot of good successes with some of my patients with just spiritual healing, without any pharmaceuticals. So, although that is not always successful, of course, but I think it plays an important role. And it's the same thing here. When you are confronted with pesticides, for example, or other toxic chemicals in the environment, I think we need also to think about the spiritual characteristic of the community, how it is disrupted by this kind of external intervention, for example, by big plantations that desecrate certain spaces in that community. So I think this is important. These are all important. But I don't have the luxury of time, so let me now give you a general definition of what is good health. It's actually in general accepted by the World Health Organization, except that they don't include the spiritual and the aspect about harmony with the environment. So essentially, good health is not only the absence of disease, but the state of complete physical, mental, spiritual, and social well-being in harmony with the environment. I would like to emphasize the social well-being here because even the United Nations have recently recognized that. They should have recognized it from the very beginning. And they have actually formed a commission on social determinants of health within WHO, the World Health Organization. Unfortunately, there's no political will to implement that decision because the social determinants of health commission of the WHO has very little money and they could come up with very little. And many governments don't really listen to what they're saying. Still, the predominant paradigm is what we call the reductionist paradigm. They concentrate on pharmaceuticals, vaccines, and all those things that are actually neglectful of the social determinants of health. But in fact, most of the scientific evidence, even on infectious diseases, the greatest determinant for health would be social factors. Does your father have decent income? Do you have proper sanitation? Do you have proper housing? Is there peace in the community? Is there no conflict, whether it's social or physical or whatever? All these things actually matter more than the micro. For example, tuberculosis. In the Philippines, we still have a lot of tuberculosis cases in most communities. And they always focus on the medicines. And yet they don't focus on the poverty in the area. If you solve the poverty in the area, you'll solve more than 80% of the tuberculosis cases. Of course, we still need the medicine, but that is not the primary factor. Even with other infectious diseases, namely dengue, malaria, HIV, AIDS, whatever. It's not the vaccine that is the primary factor, I think. If you look into the history of all these diseases, the diseases drastically came down in terms of incidence even before the advent of pharmaceuticals and vaccines. More than 80% of the incidences if you look into the history of medicine. So how come most of the efforts are on the pharmaceutical intervention, vaccine intervention, and everything like that? There's another controversy about vaccines, but I won't deal with that right now. And so I think we need to consider all those things and be more holistic in our point of view so that we better understand the problems confronting us pertaining to chemicals and perhaps even similar problems. And it's unfortunate that right now there's no space on Earth that's actually not contaminated by pesticides and other toxic chemicals. I always emphasize the fact that there's no safe place now in the world as far as contamination is concerned. And the Inuit Indians, these are the indigenous people near the North Pole, north of Canada, have always complained at the United Nations meetings that we've been attending, how come you are poisoning us? You don't even think about the things that you're doing in your areas of the world. The Inuit Indians have the highest DDT levels in breast milk, and yet they were not using any pesticides. So it's destroying their people, their culture, destroying their civilization. You don't even know that the pesticides that we are spraying here, for example in Hawaii, in 1 month, they will go to northern Canada or in the Philippines. All the pesticides that we have been spraying in the Philippines, in the plantations, for example, a lot of these persistent pollutants will be in northern Canada in a few weeks, in fact, and they're poisoning the indigenous people there. So I think it's the collective responsibility of the global community to think about that and do something to prevent those. I would say that's probably a homicide or something. We're killing people without our knowing it. We don't intend it, but we are killing them actually by using those pesticides. So it is important that the global community should be discussing all these things, get the correct information, disseminate it in the communities, so that people will know exactly what they're doing and what are the consequences when they do these things. And that's the only time probably that we can hope to save the future generation. If you notice in this diagram, it is the face of a child because it is the children who are the most vulnerable. And it is the responsibility of all peoples in different parts of the world to protect the next generation, I think. And if we do not do something really significant in our generation, they will suffer. And you can just imagine what would happen if the next generation will have deformed children, and other abnormalities, including failure to develop normally in terms of neurodevelopmental behavior and things like that. And this is an old estimate. I'd like to now go to the pesticide poisonings happening in the whole world. It's actually an old estimate, but it's very difficult to get a good estimate from scientists. Difficult to get the information, but it has been estimated that for a year, in the period of 1 year, about 25 million agricultural workers may suffer incidents of poisoning in the areas, you know. And this only talks about the acute poisoning. It doesn't include the chronic poisoning. For example, those people who got cancer because of chronic exposure, whose immune system was destroyed, and got infectious diseases because of the depression of the immune system, and the reproductive abnormalities that happen in the community. These are not counted in this estimate. So if you include all those chronic effects, it would be tremendous in terms of population affected. But this is not going out, even in the medical journals, because before you put them out, you need so-called scientific evidence. You need to have a causal relationship proof, which is almost impossible if you look into the order factors, because you can always find confounding variables, and it's very difficult to experiment on people to find out how this group are exposed, this group are not exposed, and therefore we could conclude when something happens to this group, it's because of that positive factor. You can hardly do that with human beings. In animals, yes, perhaps, but with human beings, you cannot do that kind of experimentation. And the scientific literature is actually more than enough to say, to prove that if you are exposed to these pesticides, you are most likely to be developing all sorts of diseases. Of course, the chances are different for every individual, for every community, because our vulnerabilities are different. Children are most vulnerable, as I mentioned, so they are the most victims, and not everybody who are exposed will develop the disease. I often hear the argument that, oh, my father has been spraying pesticides in the farm, he never developed any disease in his lifetime, so this pesticide must be safe. Can you find something wrong with that argument? But it is a very common argument that's used by the corporations. So the way I answer it is, okay, let's see. There are 100 people here. I have a gun with 100 bullets. I aim at each and everyone and try to shoot each and everyone. I won't be able to hit everyone. Perhaps maybe 10 will not be hit. And can the people now who are not hit conclude that, oh, a gun is safe even if it is aimed at you because I was not hit, and therefore shooting a gun at a person is safe? That's a similar conclusion, isn't it? This is fallacious, obviously, but it is being used all the time, and people accept it, you know. But if you look into the overall aspect of it, it's quite clear. You don't even have to be a doctor. You don't even have to be like me, a medical toxicologist, to realize that. You know, these are poisons. They are designed to kill organisms. And we have similarities even to these smallest organisms. And therefore, if you are exposed to that, you can expect something wrong. It will not necessarily happen to everybody, but if you talk about a population group, then you can be sure somehow some people will be affected. Also, I like to emphasize this because I think it's important that we carry this message to the farmers who are using it, because I hear this argument very often. I've been using this pesticide for so long, or even the smokers. Sorry to the smokers, there are smokers here. Pardon me for giving this example. I always hear the argument, oh, I've been smoking for so many years, my father had been smoking for so many years, nothing happened to them, you know. But this has been debunked several times, and we know that smoking causes cancer, chronic pulmonary disease, etc., etc. You know, but it took several decades before most of the governments have accepted this, you know. But it's so obvious. So it's amazing how this kind of arguments still circulate around and get believed. Anyway, so if you look at the the potential health effects of these toxic chemicals on human health, you see practically any disease can be caused by toxic chemicals. Of course, cancer is a very prominent thing, and now it's very clear that a lot of these pesticides can cause cancer. There are a lot of scientific studies that demonstrate this. Still, of course, there are a lot of other scientists who dispute this, especially corporate scientists. That's why it's important that we also carry this message to the communities, because we cannot compete with the mainstream information that carry the false messages. And it's up to us who can understand the reality to carry that information to those people who are actually the main victims. Immune system dysfunction, as I've mentioned. And I also often hear from my colleagues who are medical doctors who would say, no, this is not caused by the chemicals. He got pneumonia, therefore the culprit must be the pneumonia bacillus. They won't even ask where that person lived. That person lived in banana plantations, being sprayed every day practically with pesticides. Can you not suspect the chemical as a source of the illness? The immune system was depressed. That's why the pneumonia bacillus overwhelmed his body. And the same is true with tuberculosis, I mentioned earlier. In fact, most of us Filipinos harbor the bacterium of the tubercle bacterium. The last time I looked at it, more than 80% actually of our students in the College of Medicine harbor the tubercle bacillus. But how many of our medical students get tuberculosis as a disease? Probably 2 or 3. Most of us actually harbor the bacterium. I don't know about the American population, but I'm speaking about the general phenomenon that not everybody will be. In fact, it's a normal phenomenon that we are exposed to this bacteria and viruses. Influenza virus, for example. Influenza virus is everywhere. We're exposed every influenza season. But how many people get actual influenza? Very little percentage of the entire population. And yet, we just say the virus is responsible for that disease. We don't look at the immune system. We don't look at the nutrition. We don't look at the housing. We don't look at the poverty level. And then we come up with vaccines that are actually very, very ineffective and dangerous. You know, influenza vaccine actually is only 30% effective in a certain select population. And it carries a lot of toxic elements in that vaccine diet. Well, as I said, this is another controversy, but I don't want this to sideline our issue about pesticide. But just to illustrate the point that kind of a narrow thinking about the nature of illness and health is harming us all, actually. And unfortunately, government policy is not attuned to common sense. You know, and in fact, even international policy. So all these kind of diseases, and very recently, endocrine disrupting effects has come to our attention, probably only about 15 years or so. And the main point that has come out because of this discussion is that even the lowest concentration of these toxic chemicals can actually cause serious health effects, especially over the long term, especially in children. For example, when you look at the contamination of pesticides in your water, they come up with an analysis, for example, let's say chlorpyrifos. They say, oh, the level of chlorpyrifos, the level of chlorpyrifos in water is only 1 part per billion, say. And it's below the so-called legal minimum acceptable level. And then they say, and therefore it is safe to drink that water. That's a very common argument because governments have come up with so-called maximum allowable concentration for most chemicals. But they came up with that so-called maximum allowable concentration not to protect health of the people, but to facilitate trade. If you look into the history of these negotiations, this so-called maximum allowable level were set there to facilitate trade, especially agricultural products. It doesn't mean that you're safe. And they use that, they calculate that figure using animal laboratory experiments that does not accurately reflect the reality of human exposure and experience to these chemicals. For example, they give different concentration of chemical to a certain group of rats. I do that actually, that's part of my work as a medical toxicologist. I do animal toxicology tests. 3 or 4 concentrations, and then we come up with the so-called no effect level, based on that calculation of three concentrations or 4 concentrations, and we measure the mortality, how many rats died. You know, that's the main measure. And then we come up with a concentration level. Oh, at this level, no animal died. And below that, we say that is the maximum allowable concentration. But we look only at the death of the animal. We didn't look closely at the brain, at the testes, at the ovary, kidney, and everything. And even if we look into that, we have not really looked deeply into the cellular level, because now we know that even a small change, for example, at the cellular level can lead to serious illness over the long term. And yet, we use that to say that below that concentration, it's safe for human beings, which is wrong. And we've been saying this even at the international community, but still, governments would stick, or international organizations would stick to that kind of interpretation. So that's a big problem. And I really feel very sad after I go to a community and find actual patients, because these are all my patients. The pictures I'll be showing you were all my patients. And this is my first patient in the banana plantation community, which I looked into. And I asked specifically from this lady for permission to use this story to share at the international community, because I was already a co-chair at that time. So I wanted to bring her story to the United Nations level. I said, yes, please do that. Perhaps people will start to pay attention to our problem if you do that, she said. And I felt very sorry, because I knew it was thyroid cancer at the time I examined her. But I didn't have the means to really support her, bring her to the hospital, have her operated, things like that. So when I came back to the community after 6 months, she was dead. So I could have done probably something to save, because she could have survived the operation came earlier. But then that illustrates the big problems in poor communities like this. They don't even have the money to bring the patient to the hospital. So these things happen all the time. And yet, I had no definite scientific proof that the cancer came from the chemical that's being used in the banana plantation. But I was sure those chemicals had a lot of relationship to the cancer, because I know the chemicals they've been spraying. And I know from the scientific literature that these chemicals, specifically the fungicides, from several scientific studies, they cause thyroid cancer. And if I see this in this kind of community being exposed to this kind of chemicals, despite the presence of other factors, I know that at least the chemical has a lot of contribution to the cancer. And I think those who have exposed her to this chemical, there's a lot of accountability. So these things happen every time. And I just showed some of the other patients. This one had severe kidney disease. After, I think, almost a year, he died. And this man is a bit more lucky, because we were able to send him. By the time I saw this man, I already had some money to help my patients. And so we were able to bring him to the hospital, and he got operated. Fortunately, it's not yet cancer that has spread, but it's a tumor that's also associated with exposure to pesticides. So it was, you might say, it's not really a very sad story. In fact, the wife was very happy. No laugh? You're very slow to react. Must be the effect of the pesticide. Anyway, that was a success story, but I want to emphasize the effect on children, the neurobehavioral effects, because I've seen a lot of children affected by pesticides. I don't have a lot of time, but I think you can easily understand that. And one of which is physical deformity, like cleft lip and cleft palate, but there's so many others. Learning disability, of course, is a very common phenomenon. In the US, in fact, we have that. And one serious consequence is cerebral palsy. I've seen that in India several times. They are being exposed to endosulfan at the time. Oh, I almost forgot, the genetically engineered crops. I wanted to explain why genetically engineered crops are dangerous to human health and environment. If you understand how they do it, it's easy to understand that they actually pose serious threat to health and environment. they take the gene from the bacterium on the left side, the small circle there, and they make a gene construct, which is actually a virus, an inactivated virus, but it is a highly infectious type virus actually when it is active. And they include also a so-called promoter gene, which is also a very invasive viral component, and it can cause also some other problems. And what I want to emphasize at this point is the antibiotic resistance gene, because they use that as a marker gene, and they force this gene construct. They bombard the genome of the corn, for example, so that they force the cells to accept this gene construct. But not all cells will accept the external genes, and therefore they put antibiotics there, and those cells which did not accept the foreign gene will be killed. Those which accepted the foreign gene because they had the antibiotic resistance gene will survive, and they will grow them into the so-called BT corn. And therefore each cell, each part, every part of that corn will now have the foreign genes, not only the pesticidal gene from the Bacillus thuringiensis, because that is the one that kills the worm in the corn, but also the promoter gene and also the antibiotic resistance gene and other genes there, because there's a concoction of genes there. And so what happens is that when this pollen comes out, and if this gets into the pollen, it will also carry with it the antibiotic resistance gene. And when you inhale the pollen or you eat the corn with the antibiotic resistance gene, that antibiotic resistance gene can go to your microbes in your intestine. And you know microbes in the intestine can cause serious disease in human beings. Like E. coli can cause septicemia in human beings for those with very little resistance. And then when you are affected with this microbe that got the antibiotic resistance gene, you go to the hospital, they give you antibiotics. Those antibiotics will no longer work because the microbe got already the antibiotic resistance gene. And that's a disastrous thing. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Is that danger? And they're not looking into this very seriously. We have been asking for more detailed scientific researches to follow that gene. Well, first, the argument they said, oh no, because even if you eat that gene construct in the corn, it will be destroyed in this acid of the stomach. Well, that has been disproven. There are now scientific studies that clearly show that even genes can survive the acid, and it can go, in fact, into the blood of the ingesting individual. Well, it cannot be incorporated into the bacteria and the intestine because there's no evidence to show that. Well, after a few years, there's evidence to show that. It's being carried actually by bacteria. So it's very clear. So the danger is there, and I'm really worried about it because there's a lot of antibiotic resistance going around right now. But of course, one of the primary causes is the irrational use of antibiotics in the first place. Doctors prescribing antibiotics not necessarily, or patients taking antibiotics unnecessarily, and antibiotics in animals that we eat. So those are contributing factors also. Well, there are other dangers I don't have time to discuss because my colleague is already staring at me, I think. Here is my timekeeper. And so I would just like to emphasize disruption of gene ecology because that is the reason why a lot of bad things can happen, including cancer. And also allergic reaction is very clear right now that genetically modified crops can cause allergic reactions. And we have actually some scientific evidence from the Philippines because our colleague from Norway took the blood of the farmers who planted the GE corn, and he has shown the presence of a specific antibodies to the genetically modified toxin in the corn. So we are sure that it was not from something else. And there are other evidences to show, if you look into the scientific, independent scientific literature about the potential health effects of genetically modified crops. So I hope you will study more on this because I think this is one of the most devastating, potentially devastating effect on the environment and eventually on health. And it's difficult to find the direct correlation at this time because this is some kind of a silent killer, so to speak. So that's why we always lobby at the United Nations level to apply the precautionary principle. When there are reasonable grounds to indicate potential harm to health and environment, precautionary action should be taken even if cause and effect relationship has not been established scientifically. Because the legal system right now, they require the victim to prove that he was harmed. I think you're familiar with the legal system in the US. You have to prove that you have been harmed. The burden of proof is on the victim, not on the polluter. So we're trying to change that with the precautionary principle. I hope, well actually you have already some precedents here in the US, for example the Great Lakes region, but unfortunately the US Constitution does not have the provision to right to a healthful environment. Most other countries will have that, including our Constitution in the Philippines. And we've used that to stop the planting of genetically engineered eggplant in the Philippines. We use the provision in our Constitution saying that we have the right, people have the right to a healthful environment. And we were able to have a rate of nature imposed on the entities, including our government agencies, to stop them planting these genetically engineered eggplants. So other countries actually have utilized that provision as a measure for protection, using the precautionary principle. Well, but despite all those problems, while we are trying to approach the problem in a more holistic way and more long-term way, there are mitigating measures that people at the communities can use, especially in the rural communities. Maybe it may not be very applicable in the cities, but activated charcoal can actually absorb many of the pesticides and other toxins in the food or in water, and you can use that to purify water actually quite cheaply. But of course, if you can afford to buy all these sophisticated filtering machines, that's also all right. But this is particularly useful in poor communities who cannot afford to buy these things. And one very useful plant is the moringa plant, which I find in Hawaii. While traveling in Hawaii, I saw a lot of this at the side of the road. And you can use the mature seeds, dry it, put the rice seed, mix it with water, and 2 seeds can clean 1 liter of water. Of course, there are specific procedures, but it's quite simple that can be utilized by people. And it's also important to educate the young people. This is my grandson, and he's now my partner in advocating anti-pesticides campaign. And he was already interviewed on TV about this issue. That's why I'm very happy and he challenges people who offers him apple. His dad, in the beginning, when the dad was catching what I was doing to his son, his dad was offering him an apple. Suddenly, my grandson said, "Is that organic?" So now they're eating organic food in their household because my grandson demands it, and he can give you the scientific name of the vegetables he's eating, mind you. So I hope we involve also the youth because I think it's very important. After all, as I said earlier, it is the future that is at stake. So thank you very much for your patience. I know I overshot again my time, so sorry, Gilbert, I eaten up into your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romy. I think I have to turn off your microphone.
Oh.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Nope.
Hello? I think I'm just the other one. Okay, hi, my name is Gilbert Sape. I'm with the Pesticide Action Network Asia Pacific. Our office is based in Malaysia. I'm also a Filipino citizen. I was born and raised in Manila, but I live in Thailand. I live in Bangkok at the moment. I've been working with the Pesticide Action Network Asia Pacific for the last, I think, 10 to 12 years. And I'm basically involved in organizing and campaigning at the community level in many Asian countries, from Indonesia to Sri Lanka to Nepal, name it. And half of my time I also spent at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, representing the civil society organization, which is my organization, mostly negotiating with the governments, on food security issues. There's one very good committee within the FA, which is called the CFS, the Committee on Food Security, which is, I think, is a quite unique space because it has gone through a reform process. In the old days, we were not allowed to participate, or we were allowed to participate in this kind of meetings of governments. Usually you're an observer and you put at the end of the line if you want to speak. And your opinion is not recorded and you're not part of the proceedings. But we challenged this institution for the last, I would say, 10, 12 years. And in 2007, 2008, they listened to us eventually, and they decided to adopt the reform process. So we're now on equal footing with the government, but we're not a voting member. But we can debate with the government, and we can challenge them. Sometimes, it gives us good results. Sometimes it's not. I'll tell you more story about it. So I'm supposed to talk about the politics of pesticide, but I don't think I have enough time to do that. I will just go through some of my slides and will skip some which I think Romy had discussed. So just briefly, the chemicals that we are using for our pesticides are the same chemicals that we used, these countries used during the war. Post-war, they were sold as broad-spectrum pesticides. In Asia, pesticide is a big problem, and you can trace it to the establishment of the IRI, or the International Rice Research Institute, in 1960. It's a 620 acres experimental farm in the Philippines. This is around 2 hours away from Manila in Laguna, with support from the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, which are both U.S. agencies. And this was established as part of the Revolution. And they came into the picture because they were the ones who introduced the hybrid varieties of rice, or the HYVs, which are, as you know, dependent on pesticide use, because each rice has its own partner pesticide. Not only one, sometimes two, sometimes three. And of course, when you talk about pesticide use, you talk about corporate control. So they come together. It has a very dark history, IRI. It's celebrating its 50 years, I think, this year. It grabbed land from the farmers, the original settlers in that area. It wiped out original rice varieties in the Philippines and worldwide. In the Philippines, it was responsible for the vanishing of 5,000 traditional varieties of rice and indigenous varieties. But I think now many organizations are involved in recovering some of these varieties. I think they managed to save around 500. And we believe that the IRI has in their seed banks still have the traditional varieties, and we want to get them back. It's not working at the moment. Just like in Kauai, there are so many, there are workers who have been sick as part of their experiment. As you know, they also use pesticides, and a lot of people actually died as a result of this. Unfortunately, they have a diplomatic immunity. We cannot sue them. And we've been trying like every year to sue them by introducing a bill in the Congress to remove their diplomatic immunity, but it doesn't prosper. So it is that powerful. And if you have any ideas on how to go about this, please let us know, because we're running out of, we have many ideas, but they are not working. But we're not giving up. Like every year, every April 4, April 4 is the IRI Day. Yeah, we have a mobilization in front of IRI every year. But just to mention that IRI is not only in the Philippines, it's everywhere. It's in every part of the globe which has rice growing communities. It's in India, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, name it. So why do we need pesticides? The industry always say we need to feed the world, but the reality is pesticides are mostly used for cash crops, not really for crops for local consumption. And the UN, in several instances, declared that there's enough food in the world. In the US, it's very, very obvious when you buy a meal. It's actually good for 2, good for 3. Actually, the world is producing enough. The problem is access. And it's the lack of income to buy food that is basically preventing people from consuming healthy and culturally appropriate food. Just to go through quickly, this is the some of the outcomes of the Green Revolution in many countries in Asia. A good example of this is in Punjab, in the north of India. It's a very, very dry place. And as a result of monocropping of combination of rice and wheat in the 1960s, land is very much degraded, water is depleted. Its agricultural sustainability is a big question mark, definitely. And there's so much debt burden on the farmers. So why do they accumulate debt? I'll talk about that later in a while. So despite the amount of pesticides that we are using, you have the resurgence of pests actually, and at the same time you have a problem of pest resistance. It's actually the problem is not being solved, and despite that, the companies are still producing new pesticides, new chemicals every year. It doesn't stop. I have some data here about the insects showing resistance to 360 different chemicals compounds involving 542 species. Pesticides are expensive, no? So loans are taken to buy them. In many parts of Asia, even in Latin America and Africa, they don't call it poison, actually, they call it medicine. And that's part of I would say this is the fault of the agricultural workers in the 1970s who would prescribe pesticides to all sorts of problems in the field, in the farm. In Malaysia, in Indonesia, there's a big problem. As I mentioned, they call it medicine. So if there's something wrong with their farm, they have to buy medicine. And it's addictive, and that's why they accumulate so much debt. One good example of this is the farm crisis in India. And if I may add, just recently, the problem actually was brought by the introduction of the BT cotton, which is owned by Monsanto. So BT cotton was introduced in India, particularly in the state of Andhra Pradesh. And the farmers were promised, say, X amount of money, X amount of income for a year, so they have taken loans from the loan sharks to buy first the seeds, and then second to buy the pesticides that go with it. And it didn't work. They failed miserably. And so that resulted to debt accumulation, and then farmers taking their lives by taking pesticides. And we usually use this type of pesticide which is called paraquat because it has no antidote. And paraquat, as you know, is produced by Syngenta, which is a Swiss company. And what is ironic is that even in Switzerland, paraquat is banned. But the Swiss company, still keep on producing pesticide. I think it's still legal to use it in the US. It's still legal in many countries in Asia. But in most countries in the EU, they ban the paraquat already. So who profits? These are the big corporations. We know this. I just want to show one slide. And this is the amount of the income, the profit they make. Actually, the pesticide industry is a $45 billion industry, and it's controlled by 5 or 6 corporations, and they also control the seed market. There's no new data. I don't know when it will be available, but this is the old data. Probably it's higher now with the amount of pesticide that they use in Hawaii. If you look at the data, the same companies involved in pesticide production are the same companies involved in the seed production. So it's the same company. And of course, you have the same company involved in manufacturing and distribution. In Asia, we have documented a lot of misinformation in terms of pesticide use and how they market it. This is just a good example on how Syngenta would say that the pesticide that they're producing is insecticide that it will increase rice yields, and it's compatible with the IPM, it's the Integrated Pest Management. You know? But of course, as we know, it's not true. That's one example on how they do it. This is also one misleading advertisement that which is very common in Asia, I would say, and we have been documenting this. This is a violation of the FAO International Code of Conduct on pesticide distribution and use. It's a code of conduct which actually Pan Pesticide Action Network developed together with the FAO. And so why is it a violation, Romy?
Advertisement is a violation.
Advertisement is a violation.
Advertisement with giving.
When you entice them to, for say in exchange, if they buy this, they might win a car or a motorcycle. It's a violation of the code, and also it doesn't say that the pesticide is harmful to health and environment.
There's no warning.
There's no warnings. It's also a violation. So normally we would just document it and then would report it to the FAO and say they're violating this and that. And of course the FAO would just reprimand the corporations because there's no legally binding documents that would, punish them. And of course, the reason why they exist and why they're very strong is because of the influence of these corporations on their governments. These are just a few examples on how the revolving door practices in the US being done. You have government officials working as consultants for these corporations and vice versa. And this is very common practice when you have the UN negotiations. You will see the lobbyists from the corporations and the government sitting at the same table, exchanging notes, checking with each other if they agree on the points that is put forward on the table, if they agree or disagree. It's very transparent. They don't hide anything. Even the FAO as an institution is very much influenced by the corporate agenda. In the civil society mechanism that I have mentioned to you, or the Committee on Food Security, in the reform process, the civil society has its own body now, which is called the CSM, Civil Society Mechanism. And the private sector said, we should also have our own. So they created their own, which is the PSM, Private Sector Mechanism. And in that group, you have all the lobbyists from Syngenta, from Dow, from Monsanto. And they visit together in one table and try to negotiate. Of course, we don't agree on many things, but that's reality. There's no legally binding document, legally binding instrument at the moment that would make these corporations accountable. They're getting creative in getting what they want. At the FAO level, they don't use the word genetic engineering anymore. They don't use the word GMO. They don't use the word pesticides, which adds to the confusion now because they're so creative. They call it food science, they call it biofortification, they call it farm inputs. So nobody uses the word pesticide anymore. If you look at the documents that have been coming out of the FAO the last 4 or 5 years, it changes the whole dynamics of the negotiation. Of course, it's very visible here in Hawaii. Violates the right to information. The pesticide companies wouldn't want to show the list of pesticides that they use because it's against, it might hurt their business, so which means they are more concerned about their profit than their health or the welfare of the community. in general. But communities are fighting back in many parts of Asia, which is good. We have been using the food sovereignty as a framework and also as a platform. Communities are declaring their territories as pesticide-free and GMO-free. Sometimes with the support of the local council. And I was just having a conversation with Romeo about this. I think even local communities can actually do their own testing now in terms of GE and check if your field is contaminated. Technology is getting cheaper now. You can buy a portable testing kit, and it should be available in the US. And if you suspect that that your field is contaminated, and if it shows the sign that it's contaminated, you can have a verification and you can send it to the laboratory. Unfortunately, testing is expensive. We have done this several times. One batch of testing is, I think it's $500. And if you live in Asia, it's a big amount of money. And the only acceptable laboratory is in Japan. So you have to send all the samples to Japan. But I think in the US, you should have access to these laboratories. There are progressive national laws that have been coming out over the years that would protect health and biodiversity, as what Ronnie had mentioned. In the Philippines, it's a new law. Actually, it's an interpretation of the Constitution. And we managed to use that to stop the field testing of BT eggplant. But the law is new, and it came after they introduced GE corn. So we need to go back to the issue of GE corn and try to use the same law. And hopefully we get a good result. Of course, the scientific communities have been coming up with very good studies recently, saying that ecological agriculture, sustainable agriculture are solution to food security. Although I should not use the word sustainable agriculture, because even the term has been co-opted by the corporations. They now have a new term which they call sustainable intensification, and it's a way to show that even we are introducing this technology and that technology, we are still aiming for sustainability, but we want higher results and higher yield. So therefore, we have to combine the two words. So we call it sustainable intensification. There's a new instrument that will be available soon, hopefully, and that's the UN will establish a working group to prepare a treaty imposing international human rights legal obligation on transnational corporations. This might take a few years, give or take maybe 7-10 years, but it's a good start, and it's a good development. So, what have we done so far in our own communities? And it's just to give you some examples. Of course, we have been very much involved in organizing. We also recognize the fact that knowing about these issues, the danger of these chemicals and these technologies is really important. So we organize learning forum, and as what Romy had mentioned, we have developed our own module, which is called the Community Pesticide Action Monitoring, which is like a 5-day course, and it's, we use it in many communities in Asia, from Laos to Vietnam to Yunnan in China and the Philippines, and it's good because we managed to maximize this learning forum to be able to create change at the local level. So, for example, industrial farm, one of the highly toxic chemical was when was it banned, Roby?
About probably 2006.
2006. That was in India.
In India.
Yeah, but the global ban happened in.
The global ban only 2007. 2012.
2012. So it started with the community organizing themselves, documenting the effects of pesticide, using the same documentation to demand ban, and the local government supported it, and eventually the community was compensated. Then we have taken the issue to the international level, to UN meetings, and then that led to the global ban of glyphosate. So it shows you how you know, by simply organizing our communities can actually bring results. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's fast. You just have to be patient. Of course, it's important to build alliances. So we involve not only the farm workers, but also the farmers themselves and the consumers. Because food should be everyone's business. We should be concerned about what we put in our mouth. And so it should be a community issue. We maximize the existing law, or we propose creating new ones. We take direct action. I think this is really effective for us. Above, the picture above is basically the farmers in the Philippines uprooting the genetically modified rice. This is on field trial, and they filed a case in the beginning, but I think they withdrew the case because they don't want to have bad publicity. Of course, they wouldn't get the sympathy of the media if they pursue it. But this whole thing created a big media event in the Philippines, because suddenly you have small farmers taking action, fighting a big corporation like Syngenta. And I think we won this case, at least this part. We have to do a lot more, but for us, it worked. And then one direct action, of course, is the farmers in India not buying genetically modified cotton. They said, no, we will not buy your cotton anymore. And actually, that led to the decline of income of Monsanto in India. And I don't think they're doing good in India. They might close shop. Now, let's see.
Korea is a good example.
Korea.
They rejected corn from US.
Yeah, the call from US. So many good examples. And I think one effective tool that we are using also is participating in the policy advocacy. So we try to build linkages between the community and the global debates at the global level. And actually this one, I told some of the folks from Hawaii, this one I think we should maximize this value, because somebody has to confront the US government. When the US government attend meetings at the international level, of course, it's a very powerful country. They're bringing all their experts from the capital, from DC, to negotiate on instruments or whatever voluntary guidelines that are on the table. And the attitude of the US is really, for me, is really bad, because the tendency is for them to really make sure that you have a very weak document by introducing really conservative measures or whatever. And once the document is done, so basically you have a very diluted document, they would walk out and will not endorse it. So that's their strategy. That's their strategy when we discussed the voluntary guidelines on right to food 10 years ago. They didn't endorse it, although they participated actively. They didn't endorse the voluntary guidelines on land tenure that was adopted by the governments 2 years ago. But again, they diluted the whole thing. And now the ongoing negotiation is the new principles on, the principles on responsible agricultural investment, which proves to be a really, really contentious document, because it's a big issue, the whole issue. It's difficult to define what is responsible to begin with. There's so many interpretation. What's the meaning of the word responsible? China has a different take on the word responsible. The US, of course, will have a different take on responsible. So the negotiation should have finished in May. I was there in May, but we didn't manage to finish the whole text. I think we only managed to finish like 30%. And the next round will be in August, next week actually. And the biggest and most contentious part of the document is the do no harm principle. which means if you do any business in agriculture, you should not harm the environment, and you should not harm human beings. And of course, China is opposing it. The U.S., we're expecting to oppose it, but we don't know. Let's see. They might have a different way to phrase it and come up with something creative, which is very common. But we're looking forward to this kind of to this text. And so I think Hawaii should participate in this kind of forum and just debate with your government and talk to your government. Because if you can convince your government to agree on certain things that are important for the community, it will not only benefit your community, it will benefit us as well. Because it's a global agreement. It's a powerful tool for us. And the problem is, not many people from the communities are challenging the U.S. government. So we are quiet because we are not from this country, So we just try to debate with whatever knowledge and resources that we have. But I think somebody from the U.S. should stand up. I think somebody from Hawaii in particular should stand up. And we give them a dish. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so we have a few minutes for question and answer. Do you have any questions? Yes.
My question is, the United States government is very powerful, and it's trying to have its way with the UN, and to some success and some not. And now it's taken the position of the trade agreements at the TPP level and that sort of thing. These are very dangerous agreements.
Yes.
They're secret agreements with 600 multinational corporations. And there's two factors that very few people really recognize in the trade agreements. One is that it establishes an international tribunal, and the findings of these tribunals is to protect trade, not people.
Yes.
Bottom line, profit for the 600 multinationals. Okay? In addition, these trade agreements will also be associated with security agreements, military security agreements. So this is their way of forcing and representing these 600 multinational corporations, including big agro and all these other things. This is very concerning to me. And it's all been done in secret.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. That's very concerning. That's something that we have to really think about. There's a strong position now in Asia against the TPP, and people in Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines are mobilizing already. But we still need to do a lot of things seriously. It's a new area of work, which we have.
To add to that, because I've been involved when we were discussing about the World Trade Organization agreement, and I was representing the health sector in arguing with the senators about the benefits and risks. So I read the entire agreement, that's probably 5,000 pages. And I found in the agreements a very peculiar provision. It said countries may enact measures to protect health and environment, provided that it will not restrict trade. And so I challenged the senator. I said, the one who proposed the approval of the World Trade ratification in our country. And I said, do you really understand the meaning of these words? I said, have you ever read this provision in this agreement? I said, it's very clear, even if I'm not a native English speaker, to me it's very clear that profits is more important than health and environment. Don't you agree? I asked the senators. And then the proponent senator said, oh no, not the senator. The chairman asked the Secretary of Trade and Investments, who was participant to this negotiation for the World Trade Organization. He asked the secretary, so what do you say to this comment? Asked the chairman. You know what the proponent said? Let me go back to you next hearing, Senator. They actually haven't read the provision. And yet they're proposing to the Senate for ratification. And most of the senators haven't read the agreement. That's how, because they were just relying on what the corporations were telling them. Well, in our case, of course, we were relying on what the U.S. was doing. Because, you know, of course, the Philippines is still a colony of the U.S. Don't believe that we are independent. You know, the U.S. and I don't mean anything, but just to illustrate, President Bush will tell to our president, jump! Our president will not even ask why. She will just ask from which floor, sir. You know? That's the situation in our country.
Yeah.
And it's very frustrating for me because I was also a government consultant analyzing evaluating the data given by these pesticide companies. So I was talking about endosulfan. And we were actually part of the committee. We recommended a list of these pesticides to be phased out or banned by our government based on our findings and evaluation, based on our field examinations also. And I was actually examining patients at that time. So we recommended a few days, maybe 6, to our government. And we showed also that these are not necessary. You know what? After 2 months, our committee was dissolved. The pesticides remained. That's how powerful they are.
Yes.
So that's why I want to emphasize what Gilbert was saying. But we haven't given up. I'm still a consultant of my government, but they don't call me anymore to evaluate these pesticides.
Maybe you change your number. Any questions? Yes.
What is the common man to do? Pretty much, to hear you talk about the politics and all, like, it's just the word changes and all the changes. You're never going to win on the politics side. So what is the common man to do to get Monsanto, all these companies out of our lives?
Oof.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to answer that question, but I can answer it based on my experience at the community level. In India, they basically chase out Monsanto. That's the only way to do it, you know. The farmers themselves documented how BT cotton failed miserably in the state of Andhra Pradesh. The farmers themselves. So one NGO actually provided them a training on how to document using the videos and everything. So the farmers went to the field, documented the whole process and everything, and they showed it to the other farmers. And everyone, speak up basically, and that led to the decline of income of Monsanto in that state. So I think while it's good to have international instruments, they mean nothing if the communities are weak. We're not willing to take action. It will only work if the communities themselves are willing to say, no, we will not allow you to destroy our environment and our human health. And for me, that's the most effective way to deal with it. And sir, there's another question.
I just want to add to that, though, but on August 9th, we get to vote. In every single district, there are environmental candidates. And if you look and search them out, I highly recommend you vote and everybody vote for them. That's about the only way we can really make the kind of community change you're talking about.
Yeah, I agree. I sort of forgot that because we don't trust our governance anymore. So I missed the governance part. Yes, it's important. It's important. I think if there's opportunity to choose good candidates to have great platform, please support that candidate. And I think it would make a big difference.
I'm running for county council district 4.
Yeah.
I'm the strongest environmental scientist.
Yeah, because I should have said that in many of our struggles, some local government officials are really, really helpful and allies when the communities declare their territories as pesticide and GM-free, they would support it through a resolution. Okay, we will have your community as GM and pesticide-free. So it's really helpful. And there's one there.
On the antibiotic-resistant gene, you had mentioned, sir, doctor, that there were a few people that were coming up in the blood through an independent lab.
Well, when I talked about the blood samples,
Yes.
these were the farmers. These were the farmers who actually planted BT corn. It's not awesome.
Can you hear him?
Yes.
Yes.
I think
It's
my voice
on
is
now.
strong enough.
Yes.
And they actually suspected it was the BT corn that was responsible for the symptoms of pain, skin reactions and things like that, including diarrhea. But the companies were saying, no, it must be something else because BT corn is safe. And so we called a friend from Norway, Dr. Tragic to be specific, and he came over and he suggested he takes blood samples to find out whether there's specific antibody to the BT toxin, which comes from the BT corn. So if you demonstrate that, that means that the allergic reaction of the farmers isn't coming from the food that is not GE, but from the GE corn because it's BT toxin specific antibodies. So indeed, he found this BT antibodies to BT toxin. So we concluded that this is proof enough to show that it's the BT corn that is causing this allergic reaction. Of course, he was castigated by other scientists because because there are certain protocols in scientific studies like this. And because of the urgency of the information, he put out the information in an international conference in Singapore without completing the whole set of studies. But the most important aspect has already been finished, which is demonstrating that there are specific antibodies to the blood. And that's proof enough for us that it's the BT toxin. And they cut his funding. So that was different from the antibiotic resistance gene. What I was talking about the antibiotic resistance gene is that the arguments of the companies saying that that will not happen because the gene from the corn, even if it enters your stomach, will be destroyed by the stomach acid. That has been proven false. It will not happen because the pollen will not be carried by other insects. That has been proven false because there is now definitive proof from the scientific literature that it can be carried by insects. They said it will not enter the blood. That has also been disproven by independent scientific studies. And therefore, the danger of the spread of antibiotic resistance gene is quite real. It's very real and probably happening now. We just don't know exactly to what extent because there's no funding for this kind of studies. A lot of US scientists, our colleagues, wanted to follow up this kind of studies. They're not given money to do these studies because of the big influence of the big companies. When I was a medical student, most of the scientific literature, more than 80%, was publicly funded. Only less than 20% would be influenced by the big companies. Now it's the opposite. And unfortunately, most of the scientific information now would be controlled by big corporations.
So basically, it's tainted by the corporation.
Paid for.
Yes, sir. Then, okay.
Can you tell me why our elected representatives aren't here tonight listening to this?
Sorry?
Can you tell me why? Can you tell me why our elected representatives on this island aren't here tonight to listen to this?
I invited Gregory Illigan to come.
I'm thinking that maybe, I don't know, Blake, did you invite all our council members?
Yeah.
You did invite them all tonight? So you can remind them when you talk to them in public, that we suggested you come and listen to this tonight and then you know what we're talking about to you. I think that's a good point we all need to make on these types of meetings.
Thank you for that comment. I just want to point out that we do have 3 candidates
I understand that.
that are with us tonight, so I'd like to just point them out and say thank you to them. So we have Fran Puel running for county council in the back here, District 5. We have Roy Lozano running for County Council District 4. And then we have Edwin Miranda running for State Senate in District 2. So thank you for being here with us tonight.
And please come after you're elected.
I have another question, please.
Wait, let's give everybody just a turn, yeah?
Whatever happened to that race research center funded by Rockefeller?
Which one? Erie.
It's IRA.
It's still there.
Is it still in existence?
Yeah.
Still there.
It's still there.
Who's funding it now?
Who's funding it now, Romy? I think they still get some money from the state foundation.
Yeah, the usual foundations
Yeah.
funding them, and actually US government, of course.
It's still,
It's
Yeah,
a big,
Los
it's a big.
Say Los Baños. Yeah.
Because it's funded by, yeah.
Oh, you from there?
I'm from there.
Oh, you're from here? Oh.
I know the dark district.
Okay. Yeah.
But during that time, it was the big, new rice variety.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So are they still doing research?
Yes.
But now the Philippines does not produce rice.
The GMO rice.
No, they are involved now in the. They are involved now in the genetically modified
So
rice.
we import now
Yeah.
instead of
Yeah,
export.
yeah.
So what happened?
We still produce, but very
Yeah.
small.
So that was a big to-do.
Yeah, we get our rice now from
60s, 70s.
The
Yeah, I
US.
remember
Big
that
thing.
they
Now-
doubled the rice production.
Yeah, they told us.
I
Like,
guess that's,
now,
don't know enough.
I don't know.
So I want to just respect everybody's time. It's 8 p.m. and I want to respect our speakers' time. They haven't had time to eat. So if we could all just give them a warm round of applause. If you have any additional questions, please come on down. We certainly have time to mix and talk. But thank you all so much for coming. The Center for Food Safety is committed to continuing to offer educational events on Hawaii Island. So if you have ideas for speakers that you would like us to bring in, or workshops, or you have particular needs that your community organization is interested in us working with you on, please just let me know.